Imagine a quiet Sunday morning in May of 1957. You are in the small market town of Hexham, England. The air is damp, the cobblestones are slick, and the smell of coal smoke is drifting from the chimneys. This is a town where everyone knows everyone. It is a place of routine. John and Florence Pollock lived in a modest home filled with the sounds of laughter. Their daughters were their entire world. 11-year-old Joanna was the quiet one, a protective older sister who took her responsibilities seriously. 6-year-old Jacqueline was her shadow, a playful child with a gap-toothed smile who followed Joanna everywhere. On this particular morning, the girls were dressed in their Sunday best. They were excited because they were walking to church with their friend Anthony. As they walked down the familiar streets, the girls were skipping. They were just a few yards ahead of the adults. The town was peaceful until the sound of a high-revving engine shattered the silence. A local woman, overwhelmed by a personal crisis, had lost control of her vehicle. She didn't hit the brakes. She didn't swerve. The car climbed the curb at high speed and struck the children from behind. In an instant, the laughter in Hexham was replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it would never lift. Joanna and Jacqueline were gone. The grief that hit the Pollock household was not a standard grief. It was a complete fracturing of reality. Florence became a recluse, moving through the house like a specter. But John Pollock reacted differently. He was a man of deep, almost mystical faith. He didn't believe his daughters were gone forever. He began to tell anyone who would listen that he had received a vision. He was certain that his girls were coming back to him. A year later, Florence became pregnant. John was ecstatic, but his behavior started to worry his neighbors. He didn't just say he was having another child. He insisted he was having twins, and that those twins would be Joanna and Jacqueline reborn. The local doctor told John he was being irrational. There was no history of twins in the family. During the checkups, the doctor could only hear one heartbeat. He warned John that his obsession would lead to a devastating disappointment. On October 4th, 1958, the medical staff at the hospital were stunned. Florence gave birth to twin girls. John named them Jennifer and Jillian. As soon as the babies were cleaned and wrapped, John began to look for proof. He found it. Jennifer had a thin, white scar on her forehead. It was in the exact same location where Jacqueline had received 3 stitches after falling off a bucket years before. Then, John turned the baby over and found a dark birthmark on her waist. It was a perfect match for a mark Jacqueline had been born with. When the twins were 3 months old, the family moved away. They went to Whitley Bay, a town far enough away that the twins would never hear the whispers of the tragedy. They grew up in a house with no photos of their deceased sisters. Their parents never spoke of the accident. When the twins turned 3, John decided it was time to visit Hexham. As the car crossed the town line, the twins woke up from their naps. They didn't look confused. They looked excited. They began pointing out the windows at landmarks they had never seen in their lives. They pointed at a large stone building and shouted, "That is our school. The swings are behind the wall." They were correct. When they arrived at their old house, the girls didn't wait for their parents. They ran to the front door and reached for the spot where the spare key used to be hidden. Inside, John went to the attic and brought down a box. He hadn't opened it in years. It contained the old toys belonging to Joanna and Jacqueline. Jennifer reached in and grabbed a tattered doll. She hugged it and said, "I missed you, Mary." That was the specific name Jacqueline had given that doll. Gillian picked up 2 toy soldiers and told her mother that one belonged to her and one belonged to Joanna. She knew which toy belonged to which sister without being told. The most terrifying moment happened when the twins were playing in the garden. A car pulled into the alleyway and the engine backfired. The girls dropped to the ground, covering their heads. Jennifer began to scream, "The car. It is coming for us again. The blood is in my eyes." By the time they turned 5, the memories began to fade. The frequency of their past lives seemed to drift away, leaving them as normal children. But John Pollock spent the rest of his life watching his daughters, knowing that the wall between life and death had, for a brief moment, become transparent. The Big Thompson Canyon in Colorado is a place of staggering, rugged beauty. It is a world of massive granite walls and a river that roars like a freight train. In October of 1999, Alan Atadero decided to take his 3-year-old son, Jared, on a group hike in this wilderness. Alan was a single father who was famously careful. He didn't just watch Jared, he hovered over him. Jared was a bright, energetic boy. On this day, he was wearing a bright blue pullover jacket and a pair of sturdy little sneakers. He was the mascot of the hiking group, running between the adults and telling them stories about the monsters he thought lived in the caves. The group consisted of about a dozen people from a local church. They were all adults, and they were all keeping an eye on the little boy in blue. The trail they were on was narrow, carved into the side of a mountain. To their left was a steep rock face. To their right was a 30-foot drop into the freezing waters of the river. As the group approached a sharp, blind corner where the trail hugged a massive granite shoulder, Jared ran about 50 feet ahead. He was playing a game, trying to scout the path for his father. Jared rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. Alan and the other hikers were laughing at Jared's energy. They continued walking at a steady pace. They turned that same corner exactly 15 seconds after the boy. The trail ahead was a straight line for nearly 100 yards. It was completely empty. Alan didn't panic at first. He thought Jared was crouching behind a boulder. He called his name, expecting to hear a giggle. But there was no giggle. There was only the sound of the wind whistling through the pines and the distant roar of the river. Alan ran forward, searching every nook and cranny of the rock face. He looked down at the river, but the water was clear and there was no sign of a splash or a blue jacket. The search that followed was one of the largest in Colorado history. Search and rescue teams arrived with bloodhounds. They brought in expert trackers who could identify the footprint of a squirrel. They used helicopters equipped with state-of-the-art thermal imaging, but the results were haunting. The bloodhounds followed Jared's scent up the trail. They reached the exact spot where he had rounded the corner. Then, the dogs stopped dead. They began to circle the area, whimpering and looking up at the sky. It was as if Jared's scent had simply been pulled upward into the atmosphere. For weeks, Alan stayed in the canyon. He lived in his car. He walked the trails until his boots fell apart. He consulted psychics and mountain experts. Everyone had a theory, but none of them made sense. A mountain lion would have left a blood trail or a struggle mark. An abduction would have been seen by the hikers who were only seconds behind. Jared had been deleted from the physical world. 4 years passed. Alan was living in a state of permanent mourning. Then, in 2003, 2 hikers were exploring a high, craggy ridge nearly 1,000 feet above the original trail. This area was so steep and dangerous that search teams had largely ignored it in 1990, assuming a toddler could never reach it. The hikers found a single shoe bleached white by the sun. Then they found another. Finally, they saw a flash of blue tucked into a crevice. It was Jared's jacket. When the investigators reached the site, they found a scene that broke their logic. The jacket was not torn. It wasn't shredded by claws or teeth. It was in one piece, but the most disturbing detail was the pants. They were found a few feet away, perfectly turned inside out. The sneakers were sitting side by side, with the laces still tied in a double knot. There is no animal in the world that carefully removes a child's clothing, turns the pants inside out, and leaves the shoes tied. And there is no 3-year-old boy who could have climbed a 1,000-foot vertical cliff in 15 seconds without being seen or heard. Alan Atadero was left with his son's blue jacket, and a mystery that suggests our national parks contain pockets of space where the rules of physics no longer apply. Imagine you are living in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles in September of 2008. The weather is warm and the evening air is still. For the family of Charles Peck, life was about to change for the better. Charles was a 58-year-old man who had spent his career working for Metrolink. He was a loving father and a man of routine. He was traveling to Los Angeles for a job interview that he was sure would be the final piece of his professional life. On September 12th, Charles boarded a Metrolink commuter train. He was heading toward Moore Park. The train was crowded, with people heading home from work. Charles was sitting in the front carriage, likely reviewing his notes for his interview. At 4:22 in the afternoon, the frequency of the day was shattered. The Metrolink train collided head-on with a Union Pacific freight train in the Chatsworth district. It was one of the worst rail disasters in American history. The force of the impact was so great that the first carriage was crushed like an aluminum can. When the news of the crash reached the family of Charles Peck, they were devastated. They knew he was on that train. His children and his fiancée, Andrea, rushed to the scene. They waited behind the police tape, watching the smoke rise from the wreckage. They were prepared for the worst. But then, something impossible happened. At 9 o'clock that night, nearly 5 hours after the crash, Andrea's phone began to ring. She looked at the screen. It was Charles. She answered immediately, her voice shaking as she screamed his name. But there was no voice on the other end. There was only the sound of static and a faint rustling. Then, the line went dead. Over the next 11 hours, Charles Peck's phone called his children, his siblings, and his fiancée exactly 35 times. Every time they answered, they heard the same thing: static and the sound of someone breathing on the other end. They were filled with a sudden, desperate hope. They told the rescue workers that Charles was still alive. They believed he was trapped in a pocket of the wreckage, unable to speak, but using his phone to lead them to him. The rescue teams used the signal from the phone to narrow down their search. They focused all their energy on a specific section of the debris that they had previously skipped. They worked through the night, fueled by the knowledge that a man was calling out from the darkness. At 11:30, the following morning, they finally reached the area the signal was coming from. They found Charles Peck, but as the rescue workers pulled him from the wreckage, the glitch became clear. The medical examiner determined that Charles Peck had died instantly at the moment of impact at 4:22 the previous afternoon. His injuries were so severe that he could not have survived for even a second, let alone 11 hours. The most disturbing part of the story is the phone. Despite the fact that his family received 35 calls from his number, the phone was never found. The investigators searched every inch of the wreckage around his body. They searched his pockets. They searched the debris. The phone had vanished. To this day, the family of Charles Peck believes that his spirit stayed behind in the wreckage, using a frequency we don't understand to make sure his body was found and returned to them. He made 35 calls from a phone that didn't exist after he had already left this world. Lars Mittank was a 28-year-old man from Germany who had everything going for him. He was tall, athletic, and well-liked by his peers. In July of 2014, he traveled to Varna, Bulgaria for a week of sun and celebration. Varna is a beautiful resort town on the Black Sea, known for its vibrant nightlife. Toward the end of the trip, Lars was involved in a minor scuffle at a fast food restaurant. It was a silly argument over football teams. During the fight, Lars was struck in the side of the head. He didn't think it was serious until the next morning when he realized he was totally deaf in one ear. He visited a local clinic where a doctor told him his eardrum was ruptured. The doctor gave him a stern warning. The pressure in an airplane cabin will cause your ear to expand. It could lead to a stroke or permanent brain damage. You cannot fly. Lars told his friends to go back to Germany without him. He checked into a cheap, isolated hotel called the Hotel Color. It was a grim building in a quiet part of the city. As soon as he checked in, the frequency of his reality began to distort. In the middle of the night, Lars called his mother, Sandra. He was whispering so quietly she could barely hear him. He said, "Mom, don't use my credit cards. They are watching me. 4 men are in the hallway. I have to hide." Sandra was terrified. She tried to tell him to go to the police, but Lars hung up. He spent the rest of the night crouched in the hotel lobby, staring at the front door with a look of pure dread. On the morning of July 8th, Lars took a taxi to the Varna airport. He looked like a man who had been through a war. He entered the airport medical center to see the flight doctor, Dr. Kosta Kostov. Lars wanted to know if he was safe to fly home. The CCTV footage from the airport terminal is now legendary in the world of the unexplained. You see Lars walk into the doctor's office. He is carrying his backpack and a travel bag. He looks nervous, but relatively normal. Inside the office, Dr. Kostov began the examination. But while they were talking, a construction worker walked into the room to fix a light. Lars jumped. He looked at the worker with a look of absolute soul-deep terror. Without saying a word to the doctor, Lars stood up. He left his backpack. He left his wallet. He left his passport and his cell phone on the chair. Lars walked out of the office and began to jog. Within seconds, he was at a full sprint. He ran through the crowded terminal, knocking over travelers. He burst through the glass doors and ran into the parking lot. He didn't go toward the road. He ran toward the edge of the airport property, where a 10-foot-high fence topped with barbed wire separated the airport from the wilderness. In the video, you see Lars hit the fence. He doesn't slow down. He climbs it with the agility of a professional athlete, ignoring the barbs that were likely tearing at his skin. He drops down on the other side and runs into a massive field of sunflowers. The sunflowers were over 6 feet tall, creating a sea of yellow that stretched for miles. Lars ran into the flowers and vanished. The search for Lars Mittank was exhaustive. The Bulgarian authorities used heat-seeking drones and dogs. They interviewed every taxi driver in the city. They found nothing. There was no evidence of the 4 men Lars was afraid of. There was no evidence of a struggle. The human side of this story is the most painful part. His mother, Sandra, has spent years flying back and forth to Bulgaria. She has hired private investigators and searched the sunflower fields herself. She is haunted by the image of her son running away from a threat that only he could see. To this day, Lars Mittank remains the most famous missing person on the internet, a man who ran out of a doctor's office and into a different dimension. We hope these stories of the human side of horror have left you questioning the world around you. New broadcasts will be uploaded to explore the glitches and the shadows that most people choose to ignore. Thank you for being part of the transmission here at Disturbing Frequency. Sleep well, if you can.